Experience the spectacular soul of a continent. Feel the rhythm of Africa. Pay homage to its uniqueness in dance, music, and fashion.
This is our Africa. These are our people. It is time to celebrate our African Renaissance.
Hello, I'm Alan Donovan, founder of the African Heritage Festival and the African Renaissance shows. What you just saw was a promotional video from South Africa by South African Broadcasting Corporation for the first African Renaissance show staged in South Africa for the Telecoms Conference in 1998. I'll tell you more about that later. Kenya's African Heritage Festival was founded in 1976. It is a collection of authentic costumes from all parts of Africa with magnificent fashions created from the hand-woven and hand-printed textiles of Africa, all made in Kenya. It was formed by the original African Heritage as a cultural outreach program which traveled with its cast of models, musicians, dancers, acrobats, chefs, hairdressers, craftspeople, artists, and others to bring Africa to the rest of the world. It is now under the direction of McKenna Muraria and O.J. Hakim at the African Heritage Design Company in Nairobi. In the early 1970s, the Hotel Intercontinental asked African Heritage to stage a series of Pan-African festivals. From this beginning followed the annual African Heritage Nights, held at various hotels in Nairobi and other locations, which became one of Nairobi's premier cultural events for almost 3 decades. Irene Mugambi was the first model to model outside of Kenya, and she was the first to model and design for African Heritage. Irene was the star of the Nigerian Festival organized by African Heritage in 1972 during the first Pan-African Trade Fair in Nairobi. A young finance minister, Mr. Moi Kibaki, was one of the special guests of honor for that show. The entry at the Le Chateau in the Hotel Intercontinental that year was 10 shillings. Irene now has her own tourism and travel business. A few years later, in 1975, another spectacular young woman, Iman, took to the catwalk for the first time at the 3rd African Heritage Night at Maasai Lodge. After Peter Beard's sensational photos of Iman in African Heritage jewelry appeared, Vogue magazine stopped its presses to include one of them, and Iman became an overnight sensation, the most famous model ever to come out of Africa. Iman was to meet me in Hollywood to do a show there called Africa's Influence on Fashions. Tom Bradley, the first African-American mayor of Los Angeles, was invited as the guest of honor, but Iman never showed up. Upon her entry to America, the New York Post touted Iman as the most beautiful woman on earth coming to New York City. The minute her feet hit the pavement, she was snagged by a leading modeling agency, and the rest is history. The prophecy that she was the world's most beautiful woman actually became true, since even today, Iman continues to top the surveys of the world's most beautiful women conducted by such magazines as Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, and People. So Iman can actually claim she is the most beautiful woman and prove it. Iman's cosmetic empire is listed on the New York Stock Exchange for over $60 million, and with her much publicized marriage to famed rocker David Bowie, she is now one of the richest women on earth as well as the most beautiful. Iman is still dazzling. Here she is this year at the age of 52 on the cover of Town & Country magazine. In that same magazine, there is a photo of one of the first necklaces I designed for her, created from hippo teeth and Samburu warriors' ivory earplugs. Here is yet another cover taken this year for Vanity Fair, in which Iman looks more like the regal Iman the world knows.
You'll find me. You'll find me.
In the early 1970s, before the age of videos, the African Heritage Festival traveled to many cities in Europe and America. There was a series of shows across Europe with Hilton hotels, including one at the Habsburg Palace in Austria. Le Soir, the leading newspaper of Brussels, called the show a surprise and said, "It was a long time that something of this kind and quality was offered to us. Kenya has shown us something completely new and different. It is not only a rethinking of the whole of Black Africa, the very personal art of which remains undying and which still brings us joy and bedazzlement." In America, shows were staged for over 60,000 invited guests at the San Diego Zoo. The Kenyan food for that show was cooked in Los Angeles and trucked down to San Diego in a convoy of kitchens. The models paraded over a bridge that had been especially constructed for the show over a lagoon filled with flamingos. Two bands, one African, one American jazz, held forth on each side of the lagoon. African Heritage also staged a show at the Lincoln Center in New York City for the first Kenyan Trade Fair, and again at the famed New York Fashion Institute of Technology with leading American designers participating. But tonight our first clip commences with the 10th anniversary African Heritage Night at the Nairobi Serena back in 1982.
African Heritage has become one of Kenya's most famous institutions, and the African Heritage Nights are eagerly awaited each year as one of the year's most spectacular social and cultural events. I would like to introduce to you a group of musicians who are now acclaimed as Kenya's top musical group with one of Africa's most unique sounds, the African Heritage Band, ladies and gentlemen. Now here to start this evening's show, ladies and gentlemen, let me start with the band leader, Job Seda, who plays African percussions, vocals, and guitar. Next, we come to Shaban Onyango on drums and percussions. Then we have Ali Magomeni, guitar, vocals, and the keyboards. Guido. Then we come to Goro Kuni with saxophone, flute, percussion. Last but not least, ladies and gentlemen, sound technician Asad Rajput. And now, ladies and gentlemen, sit back and enjoy yourselves to the African Heritage Night. Thank you.
There were many stars who came through African Heritage, including Ayub Ogada, originally known as Job Seda, who was the co-founder of the first African Heritage Band in 1979. Job acted in the movie Out of Africa and in several major films, and the first African Heritage Band performed for the international premiere of Out of Africa in Nairobi. Even Mick Jagger and Jerry Hall came to hear the African Heritage Band. Samiti was another star who settled in the USA, and he continues to perform with African instruments all over the world. Ayub was recently shortlisted for an Academy Award for his music in The Constant Gardener, and he has traveled around the world with the likes of Peter Gabriel, and he has performed with leading Japanese couturier Issey Miyake. He is now recording his new album at the African Heritage House. On this album, he plays a stringed harp that is an exact replica of the first of its kind found in the world in former Samaria, now Iraq, from the British Museum. The company Anglo Gold contributed a kilo of gold to copy the bull's head on the harp and other trim. The models in the 10th anniversary show included Susan Auma, shown in a stunning red silk gown trimmed with flamingo feathers. Susan seldom smiled. Perhaps it was for this reason that famed film director Steven Spielberg picked Susan from this very video to play the role of the returning daughter from Africa for Oprah Winfrey's signature film, The Color Purple. I also did jewelry and artifacts for The Color Purple. This show also included Mildred Owiti as the head model in Maasai bridal attire. Mildred is now an executive at East African Breweries. Other models included the dazzling Gaudencia Ora, Aditya Arere, Grace Mumbi, Monica Ruweru, Florence Kabarangira, Lydia Molo, and Benedict. Many of these models have made several tours to Europe with African heritage. The first Miss World to model in African Heritage Nights was former Miss India Persis Kambata, who was in Nairobi at the time filming a movie with Sidney Poitier and Michael Caine. Persis went on to play a leading role as the bald Martian princess in the Star Trek series on American television. Sadly, she passed away. Fael Tol from Mali was another stunning head model for African Heritage. She was also photographed by Peter Beard, and she modeled for the top photographers of the world. Photographs of Fael and Lydia are by photographer Athi Mara Magadi. Here she performs a dance from her native Wadabi or Fulani tribe with dancer Patrick Govetti. In the same show was a former Miss Kenya, Patricia Maingi, now Patricia Maingi Atau, who is the marketing director for East African Breweries. Hadija was one of the most fantastic success stories of any woman to model for African Heritage. She was the first Miss Kenya to become Miss Africa, and she was then photographed by photographer Peter Beard. She went directly from an African Heritage Night to become one of the star models for famous French couturier Yves Saint Laurent. The last head model for African Heritage was Epiphany, a beautiful young model from Ethiopia. After the first African Heritage Band disbanded at the end of a European tour in 1986, African Heritage took a break for some years after a disastrous tour of the big island country of Madagascar. It then staged an elaborate comeback show at the Safari Park Hotel in Nairobi in 1990 with a sensational group, musically speaking, consisting of 3 fabulous Kenya women, the new face of Africa, Suzanne Gachukia, Joy Mboya, and Susan Matiba. last member of the old African Heritage Band, Guido Kibukutsia, joined up with Musically Speaking, later formalizing this union in his marriage to Suzanne. Together they formed the band Zanaziki and an important musical organization in Nairobi called Samawati Productions, which has promoted many other musicians. Now join us on one of African Heritage's last road shows through Europe. This tour in 1995, sponsored by the Intercontinental Hotels and Lufthansa, was probably the biggest show ever to come out of Kenya. Besides the luxury bus for the troupe, there was a caravan of lorries carrying costumes, fashions, and a series of hand-painted panels by artist Sospeter Omondi to transform all the ballrooms of the hotels and other sites into Kenya scenes with a backdrop of beaches, lakes, and Mount Kenya. There was also a lorry load of tropical plants, stage, sound, and lighting equipment, and even a couple of elephants who paraded in the city streets and squares to announce the shows.
To welcome you very much this evening. My name is Jennifer Opondo. I come from the Kenya Tourist Office here in Frankfurt. And today, it is a great honor, a real big honor for us to have you here with us to set off this big festival of African Heritage Group coming all the way from Nairobi to bring to you the culture of Kenya, to bring to you people living in Germany, Germans and foreigners living here, our culture, so that you can understand us better, so that you can have a feel of what we have in Kenya, so as to give you the feel to come and visit us in Kenya.
Jabali Africa was a group who started at the African Heritage Garden on Nairobi's Kenyatta Avenue and then accompanied African Heritage on this roadshow to Europe. They were the most exuberant group of musicians I have ever known. They never stopped moving. Even though we had shows in the afternoon and sometimes 3 shows every night, they never faded. After this tour, I left them in the USA, where they remain up to today, based in Philadelphia. The stars of this tour were head model Catherine Carl, the longest reigning African Heritage head model of all time, and Mickey Ragos, who was the perennial Mr. Kenya for 16 years and a star of the African Heritage shows for over 2 decades. Agnes Alondo was another model who worshipped Iman and Hadija and set her sights on going to Paris, where she now lives with her husband. There are now a multitude of former African Heritage models in countries around the world. One of the most talented of all African Heritage stars was Plastic Boy Maina, a contortionist and acrobat that completely mesmerized the audiences. He always got the most applause. Several times promoters approached him about taking him on a tour to various countries in the world, but he came back to Kenya, where he still remains. The most vibrant dance duo ever seen from African Heritage was Diana and Rodido from a group called Taffy Dancers, who performed with African Heritage in the 1990s to its demise in 2003. Tom and Steve were acrobats with African Heritage for many years, and Mohammed was a phenomenal stilt walker who also invented several other acts with bicycles, bicycle wheels, and other props, as well as juggling. The Best of Africa was a consortium of leading Nairobi companies and organizations set up to beautify Kenyatta Avenue in time for the centennial celebrations of Nairobi, held in October 1997, 100 years after the first railhead and supply depot was established on the black cotton soil of the present-day Nairobi. The street festival for the Nairobi Centennial celebrations included antique cars, floats, dancers, musicians, marching bands, and 100 models who were selected to represent the 100 years of Nairobi. The models wore the entire archives of Kenya's African Heritage Festival, which was on public display for the first time. This festival, I believe, was the only free event to take place in the city center of Nairobi, where throngs of thousands joined in the day's celebrations.
It is hoped that once people see Kenyatta Avenue, that this will spark interest and a regeneration of interest in renovating other parts of the city.
A young model named Emma Toe won the title of Miss Nairobi Centennial, and she went on to become a head model of African Heritage. She was selected from more than 700 contestants at the Carnivore in Nairobi. For the celebrations to usher in the new millennium in Kenya, African Heritage put together a millennium show and tour, kicked off with a two-night celebration at Nairobi Serena Hotel on a catwalk built over the hotel swimming pool.
Celebrating the best in African fashion, dance and music was the only excuse needed for one of the most glamorous end-of-the-century celebrations on the continent. Dubbed the Gala Night of the Century, the extravaganza in Nairobi, Kenya, captivated a well-heeled audience with a striking array of designs and acrobatics from 16 of sub-Saharan Africa's rich and diverse cultures. This colourful festival is the brainchild of Alan Donovan, Director of African Heritage.
We try to highlight 16 major cultures of Africa, starting with Ghana, which was the first country to become independent after colonialism, and we move on through to South Africa, the last country.
Celebrating Ghana got the show off to a regal start, with models draped in the hand-woven kente and adinkara cloth, beloved of that country's Ashanti kingdom. The second half of the show was dedicated to the creations of young Kenyan designers. The unique styles of Kenya's many tribes provide inspiration for these modern, forward-looking designers. Clothes traditionally worn by northern Kenya's nomadic Turkana people are brought up to date using innovative and modern fabrics like suede. Beadwork is the centerpiece of traditional Maasai, Kikuyu and Kamba clothing, but can also be a key fashion accessory in a more trendy ensemble. This model's spontaneous smile says it all, as she sashays down the catwalk in a stunning bark cloth dress from Uganda. While Chanel and Christian Dior are the household names of 20th century fashion, could Africa be the Paris or Milan of the new millennium? If it was up to the models themselves, the answer would undoubtedly be yes.
When you wear this, just that once, really nice. You know, you feel special. You're like a queen. You're an African queen. So, you know, it's really a good feeling.
Amidst this lavish spectacle, however, crucial issues were not forgotten, as part of the evening's proceeds will be donated to AIDS charities. But for Africa, this was a unique opportunity to portray a positive and vibrant image of herself to the world. A striking contrast to the war-torn, starving continent continually presented by the international media.
It was fantastic. This show was really fantastic because usually, you know, on French TV, when we watch Africa, it's always about war on this continent and so many problems. But here it was just color and flavor and tradition and nice things about Africa.
Nice things indeed. and for the audience, a real insight into what has made Africa a continent of creation and innovation in the last century, and what will make her even more so in the 21st.
Then African Heritage took the show to 22 other hotels in Kenya. Special guests were Africa's famed photographers Angela Fisher and Carol Beckwith, who have been my associates since the very beginning of African Heritage. African Heritage has launched their books in the United States, Africa, and Europe, as well as doing a special show called Africa Adorned for Angela Fisher's magnificent book of the same name. During the Millennium Tour, Carol and Angela launched their spectacular double-volume opus, African Ceremonies. They personally signed copies in Nairobi and Mombasa. Slides from the book were shown on the giant screen at all the hotels.